The gavel hadn't even cooled when Judge Judy leaned forward, eyes flashing like steel. Her voice cracked across the courtroom like a whip. "Ms. Crockett, you will not grandstand in my courtroom." Gasps rippled through the audience benches. Phones tilted upward, trying to catch every second. The cameras zoomed in, catching Judy's glare, a look millions of Americans know all too well, the look that had reduced countless defendants to silence. But this time something was different. Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She sat there, her hands folded, her eyes calm but unyielding. The air seemed to thicken around her. You could almost feel the energy shift. One woman wielding power, the other refusing to surrender it. For decades, Judge Judy had built her reputation on control. Interruptions, cutting remarks, sharp tongue. It was all part of her arsenal, and in that instant, she tried the same move with Crockett, a congresswoman who had weathered louder voices, sharper insults, and far more hostile attempts to shut her down. But here, inside this courtroom, the clash wasn't about case law or procedure. It was about something larger, whose voice gets heard and whose voice gets silenced. The stakes were bigger than one hearing. They were about dignity, truth, and what happens when authority tries to muzzle courage. And as Judy's words echoed through the chamber, the entire room seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what Crockett would do next. Because one thing was already clear. This wasn't going to be like any other Judge Judy moment. Her attempt to shut Jasmine Crockett down was about to backfire in a way no one, not the audience, not the cameras, not even Judy herself, saw coming. But what Crockett said next? That's what turned a heated courtroom exchange into a national moment. And if you think you've seen fiery clashes before, wait until you hear the reply that left. Even Judge Judy stunned into silence. On the surface, it looked like a simple exchange, a judge flexing authority over a witness. But beneath it, the stakes were so much higher. Judge Judy wasn't just any judge. She was a cultural icon, a symbol of no-nonsense authority, who had silenced thousands. Before, with nothing more than a raised brow and a sharp word, millions of viewers had grown up, watching her command respect by cutting down anyone who dared to challenge her. And that's why this moment mattered. Because for once, the person sitting across from her wasn't a nervous civilian with no platform. It was Jasmine Crockett, a congresswoman, a lawyer, a fighter whose entire career was built on amplifying voices the system tried to suppress. This wasn't just about order in a courtroom. It was about the timeless battle between voice and silence, truth and intimidation. Judy represented a legacy of control, the expectation that authority is enough to end a conversation. But Crockett represented something far more dangerous to that old order, a refusal to bow. The audience sensed it too. Whispers moved through the benches like sparks on dry grass. The cameras caught every twitch, every pause, every breath. This wasn't going to be one of those clips where Judy barked and the other party whimpered away. No, this time something seismic was building. Because Crockett wasn't here to play by Judy's script. She had her own, and when she finally chose to speak, she wouldn't just defend herself. She'd redefine the entire encounter. But first, the audience had to watch the storm gather. Judy pressing harder, and Crockett waiting for the perfect moment to flip it all upside down. To understand the weight of this clash, you have to understand Judge Judy. For decades, she was the queen of daytime, courtroom television, a no-nonsense enforcer who turned quick judgments into must-watch TV. Her brand was built on domination. Her power came not just from the gavel, but from the way she wielded words like weapons. She cut people down before they had the chance to breathe. A raised eyebrow, a sharp dismissal, a sudden, "That's enough!" and opponents shrank under her authority. Millions of Americans tuned in not for justice, but for the thrill of watching Judy crush anyone who dared to stumble, hesitate, or push back. But behind that performance was something more complicated. Judy's reputation was built on control, absolute unquestioned control. And that control depended on silence. When she barked, people obeyed. When she snapped, people froze. That was the formula. And it always worked. Until now. Because in Crockett, Judy wasn't dealing with an intimidated civilian or a flustered witness. She was facing a congresswoman, an attorney, a woman who'd spent her entire career staring down arrogance cloaked as authority. The arrogance Judy carried into that courtroom, the assumption that her words alone could bend Crockett into submission would become her undoing. What once looked like strength now looked like fragility. The fragility of power that only works when no one dares to challenge it. The audience didn't know it yet, but the legend of Judge Judy's unshakable control was about to meet the one person who could expose its limits and do it in seconds. Crockett didn't walk into that courtroom as just another participant. She carried with her the weight of a lifetime spent fighting battles that most people never see. Born in Texas, raised with grit and faith, she wasn't handed power. She had to wrestle her way toward it. Before Congress, before the spotlight, before her name trended on social media feeds, Crockett was a public defender. She stood next to those who had no one else in their corner. Speaking for clients society had already written off. It was in those cramped courtrooms and late-night case reviews where she sharpened her edge. She learned that justice was rarely equal. That silence was a luxury the marginalized couldn't afford. When prosecutors tried to bulldoze her clients, Crockett didn't shrink. And every time someone tried to tell her to sit down, to calm down, or to wait her turn, Crockett's answer was the same. My turn is now. So when she entered Judge Judy's courtroom, she wasn't intimidated by the legend sitting across from her. She had faced power before. She had faced arrogance before. And she had learned one undeniable truth. Authority crumbles when confronted with conviction. This wasn't a battle between a TV judge and a congresswoman. It was bigger than that. It was a collision between old authority and new courage. Between a woman who demanded silence and a woman who embodied the voices of millions who refused to be silenced. The courtroom didn't know it yet. Judge Judy didn't know it yet. But Crockett's entire life had been preparation for this exact moment. And when she finally chose to respond, she would not only defend herself, she would remind the entire country why some voices cannot and will not be muted. The tension didn't simmer, it boiled. Judge Judy, used to instant compliance, leaned in sharper this time. Her tone cut across the chamber like a blade. You are not here to deliver speeches. Ms. Crockett, you will answer the question and nothing more. The words snapped like a command, and the audience leaned forward. They had seen this act before, Judy wielding authority like a hammer, daring anyone to resist. Normally, this was the moment where the other side crumbled, stammered, or fell silent. But Jasmine Crockett didn't blink. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't break her composure. She just stared back, her silence louder than Judy's command. And that silence unnerved the judge. So Judy pushed harder. Do not test me, she warned, her voice cracking with impatience. This is my courtroom. You will follow my rules. Phones were recording, eyes locked on the duel unfolding before them. It wasn't just authority against authority anymore. It was pride against principle. Crockett shifted slightly, her expression calm, almost patient, like a storm gathering but not yet unleashed. She had waded through louder attacks than this, faced harsher attempts to strip her of her voice. And if Judy thought intimidation would work here, she was about to learn otherwise. The clash was no longer about procedure. It was about control. And Crockett was taking the power. Judy thought she owned and holding it in her silence. The question wasn't if Crockett would respond. It was when. And when she finally opened her mouth, the words would hit. Harder than any gavel, the silence before the storm had never felt so electric. The moment had stretched so long it felt like the air itself was holding its breath. Judge Judy's words still lingered, sharp, final, meant to seal the exchange. But Jasmine Crockett leaned forward at last, her voice calm, steady, and piercing enough to cut through the tension. "Judge, with all due respect," she began, her tone measured, deliberate. "Silence has never delivered justice." Crockett pressed the point home. "You can raise your voice, you can wield authority, but you cannot erase reality. The truth doesn't need permission to be spoken." Because there it was, the reply that turned her courtroom into a stage, and her authority into an afterthought. Gasps, murmurs, even a few nods of agreement swept through the room. And for once, Judge Judy didn't speak. She didn't interrupt. In seconds, Crockett had flipped the script. The gavel in Judy's hand suddenly felt smaller. The cameras didn't belong to her anymore. They belonged to the Congresswoman, who had just shattered the silence. And as Crockett leaned back, calm once again, the audience knew. Judge Judy had finally met someone she couldn't control. The silence that followed wasn't weakness, it was impact. Judge Judy, who had built an empire on having the last word, suddenly had none. And that silence was louder than any outburst she could have mustered. The courtroom felt it first. Gasps turned into hushed murmurs, then into a current of disbelief that swept across the benches. Spectators glanced at one another as if to confirm they'd witnessed the same thing. Someone had just stood toe-to-toe with Judge Judy, and won. But the real shockwaves erupted outside those four walls. Within minutes, the clip hit social media. Hashtags lit up, Nin and Crockett clap back, nears truth over power, Judy shutdown. On TikTok, the moment replayed in endless loops, stitched with captions like, "This is how you handle arrogance," and "Mic drop of the year." Twitter, or X, exploded with commentary. Journalists weighed in. Pundits spun the clip into think pieces. And ordinary Americans flooded the timeline with their own reactions. "Judy just met her match," one viral post read, racking up hundreds of thousands of likes. Even late-night hosts couldn't resist. By evening, Crockett's words were playing in highlight reels, set to applause tracks, treated like the cultural moment it had become. For Judy, it was a rare stumble, a dent in a legacy of dominance. For Crockett, it was something bigger, a symbol of what happens when courage refuses to be silenced. And for the millions watching, it was a reminder that authority isn't invincible. It can be questioned, challenged, and sometimes undone in a single unforgettable sentence. But Crockett's words didn't just stop Judy. They reignited a larger conversation about who gets heard, who gets silenced, and why voices like hers are impossible to ignore. When the echoes of that moment finally settled, the meaning of it all became clear. This was never just a courtroom spat. It was a mirror, showing America the difference between authority and authenticity, between dominance and dignity. Judge Judy had the robe, the gavel, the reputation, but Jasmine Crockett had something far more powerful, the truth, and the courage to speak it without fear. And in the end, that's what resonated. Because authority can silence a room, but it cannot silence a conscience. For those watching, immigrants, working families, students, and everyday Americans who felt their voices dismissed, Crockett's stand was more than a clapback. It was validation. It was a reminder that you don't have to shout to be strong, and you don't have to bow to be respected. She showed that true justice doesn't come from intimidation. It comes from integrity. And integrity, once spoken, carries farther than any gavel could ever reach. The moral wasn't hidden. It was written across the stunned face of Judge Judy and echoed in the roar of support across the country. No matter how big the platform, no matter how loud the authority, arrogance falls flat against conviction. And perhaps that's why the moment hit so hard. Because deep down, every viewer saw themselves in Crockett's chair. The times they'd been told to stay quiet, to step back, to let someone else's voice dominate. and they felt the catharsis of her answer, the strength of her refusal to be silenced. It wasn't just her victory, it was theirs too. But as powerful as the moment was, Crockett left the country with a question still burning in the air. What happens when all of us find the courage to answer back the same way? The gavel may have ended the session, but it couldn't erase what had just unfolded. Judge Judy, a figure long seen as untouchable, had been silenced, not by volume, not by theatrics, but by the calm, piercing clarity of Jasmine Crockett's words. And that moment wasn't confined to a courtroom. It belongs to every one of us who's ever been told to sit down, stay quiet, or accept less than we deserve. Crockett proved that power is not about how loudly you speak. It's about how firmly you stand when someone tries to take your voice away. But here's the truth. This fight doesn't end here. What Crockett did in seconds is a lesson we can carry into every room, every debate, every moment we're tempted to shrink. Silence may feel safe, but courage changes history. If you felt that spark watching her reply, if you believe voices like hers must be heard louder, clearer, and stronger, then don't just nod and move on. Be part of amplifying it. Hit subscribe right now. Tap the bell so you don't miss when moments like this shake the system. Share this video with someone who's been silenced, and remind them, the mic always belongs to truth. And tell me in the comments, did Jasmine Crockett just show us how to break the cycle of intimidation? Or is this the beginning of something even bigger? Because history doesn't just watch. It remembers who had the courage to speak